picture the scene. We are in a ridiculously upscale Manhattan restaurant in the late 1990s.
Oh, the kind of establishment where the lighting is perpetually dim and, perfectly flattering.
Exactly. The martinis are icy cold, and the power dynamic in the room is just palpable the second you walk through the door.
Right.
So, sitting at a prime table is Graydon Carter, the legendary, larger-than-life editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair. And sitting directly across from him is his boss, S.I. Newhouse, the billionaire owner of Condé Nast.
The absolute titan of the industry.
Right. So Carter leans in over the white tablecloth, and he mentions he has a good news, bad news situation.
Which, in the publishing business, or really any business for that matter, that usually signals some kind of impending financial disaster for the owner.
Yeah, you'd think so.
Oh.
But S.I. Newhouse, he doesn't flinch. He just calmly asks for the bad news. So Carter takes a breath and admits that they just finished shooting the upcoming cover of the magazine, and it happens to be the most expensive magazine cover in the history of publishing.
Oh, boy.
The invoice is sitting at $475,000.
That is staggering.
Right, and just to put that in perspective for you, if we adjust for inflation, we are talking about roughly $850,000 in today's money.
Wow.
For one single photograph. It was a fold-out image of Hollywood stars.
The sheer audacity of that number requires a moment of pause, right? Approaching $1 million modern dollars for a single piece of promotional collateral.
Exactly.
You have to consider the absolute shock that would register on the face of almost any CEO in the world hearing that figure. But Newhouse, he simply asks for the good news.
Yeah. Carter looks at him, totally deadpan, and says, well, it looks like a $475,000 cover.
That's incredible.
And the craziest part of this entire anecdote from the archives, Newhouse is totally fine with it. He just nods. He accepts it. Because in his specific, highly curated world, an $850,000 photo shoot isn't a mistake.
No, not at all.
It isn't a lapse in judgment. It's a necessary investment in illusion.
Right. He was purchasing authority. That astronomical price tag was the literal definition of their entire business model. They were telegraphing to the world that they had the resources, the access, and, the cultural dominance to command that kind of budget.
Exactly. Well, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are exploring a subject we are calling more taste than money. It's a comprehensive look into the business, the beauty, and the often completely chaotic history of fashion media.
It really is a wild ride.
It so is. I'm your host, an enthusiastic prosumer of all things glossy and glamorous, and sitting across from me is our expert business and fashion historian. Our subject today is the 130-year evolutionary trajectory of Condé Nast.
The company that essentially invented the modern concept of aspiration.
Yep. So tell them about the sources we're working with today.
Sure. So our roadmap for this conversation is built on a really fascinating stack of sources. We are drawing heavily from Michael Grinbaum's book, Empire of the Elite, alongside Susan Ronald's incredibly comprehensive biography of Condé Nast himself.
Which is such a good read, by the way.
Oh, absolutely phenomenal.
Oh.
We've also pulled in historical timelines and some deep research cultural reports to provide you with a 360-degree view of this empire.
Right, because our mission here is to trace how a tiny New York Society Gazette metamorphosed into a global arbiter of taste. We are going to unpack how this company survived near ruin in the 1929 stock market crash.
Which is a crazy story on its own.
So crazy. And how they weaponized absolute decadence as a marketing strategy in the late 20th century. Plus, how they're desperately fighting to survive today's digital reckoning.
Yeah, the digital shift is brutal.
But wait, before we can even begin to talk about the fleet of idling black town cars, or the editors flying the Concorde to Paris, or those $500,000 photo shoots, we have to travel back to the foundation.
We do. We have to look at the man who built it. Because Condé Nast was not, some old money aristocrat coasting on a trust fund.
No, not at all.
Condé Montrose Nast was fundamentally a mathematically minded Midwesterner. He was born in New York City in 1873, but his origin story is entirely rooted in St. Louis.
Right.
And to understand his psychology, you really have to look at his family dynamics. They were defined by male absence and this overwhelming female influence.
Yeah, tell us about his parents.
So his grandfather was Wilhelm Nast, who was a highly prominent German Methodist leader. But Condé's father, William Nast, violently rebelled against that strict religious upbringing.
As you do.
Right. William chased speculative wealth in Europe, failed spectacularly, and ultimately just abandoned his family.
leaving Condé's mother, Esther, to just, well, pick up the pieces.
Exactly. Now, Esther came from a wealthy French-Canadian family in St. Louis, the Benoists, though that wealth was spread incredibly thin because she was one of 15 children.
Wow, 15 children.
Yeah, a massive family. So she retreats to her family's mansion in St. Louis and raises Condé and his siblings. He was raised almost entirely by women, his mother, his sisters, his aunts.
And that environment is just critical to everything he built later.
No, completely. Growing up completely surrounded by matriarchal figures gave him an intrinsic, highly respectful understanding of women's inner lives. You have to contextualize this within the 1890s.
Right, the era of the new woman.
Exactly. These were women who were beginning to ride bicycles, enter the workforce, delay marriage, and demand a measure of equality. Condé grew up seeing women not as decorative societal objects, but as complex, driven individuals with real agency.
Which was huge back then.
Huge. That fundamental respect would become the bedrock of his approach to female-focused publishing.
I want to fast forward to a very specific moment that really highlights his meticulous nature, because his entry into the business world feels like something straight out of a Victorian novel.
It really does, the Aunt Fanny story.
Yes. So his father's sister, Aunt Fanny, had married into the massive Procter & Gamble fortune, and she decides she is going to finance the higher education of only one of Esther's sons.
Just one.
Just one. It's a total bake-off between Condé and his older brother Louis. The legend from the biographies states that Fanny visited the St. Louis home and explicitly inspected their 2 garden patches.
And the contrast was apparently stark.
Very stark. Louis's garden was a chaotic, overgrown, totally disorganized mess. Condé's garden, on the other hand, was immaculately tidy. Every single plant was meticulously organized, weeded, structured.
He was obsessive about it.
He was. And Aunt Fanny pointed to the tidy garden and decided right on the spot that Condé was the boy she was sending to college.
Now, there are historical footnotes suggesting he also impressed her by donating his meager savings to a family defense fund. But you know, the garden anecdote perfectly encapsulates his defining trait.
Which was
A ruthless obsession with order and presentation.
Yes. So Aunt Fanny's money sends him to Georgetown University. And he wasn't exactly the star quarterback. He wasn't particularly sporty at all.
No, not an athlete.
But he ends up becoming the first student president of the university's athletic association. He completely took over the scheduling, the finances, the promotion, and the fundraising for the sports teams.
He was engineering their popularity and financial success from behind the scenes.
Exactly. He was a natural producer.
And after Georgetown, he did a brief, rather unfulfilling stint studying law at Washington University. But he quickly found an opportunity to really flex those logistical muscles in the real world.
Right, the printing plant.
Yeah. His family had sunk a couple of $1,000s into a failing printing plant in St. Louis. It was bleeding money. Condé steps in, assesses the operational failure, and devises this brilliant, localized solution.
So what does he do?
He looks at the calendar and sees the St. Louis Exposition approaching. So he compiles a massive list of Midwestern exhibitors coming to the fair and offers them bundled advertising and marketing deals tied directly to his printing plant.
Oh, that's smart. He recognized a captive audience and monopolized it.
Exactly. It totally saved the printing company. And that early victory caught the attention of his old college friend, Robert Collier.
Ah, right. Collier's Weekly.
Yep. Collier's father owned a massive publishing empire, and they recruited Nast to move to New York and work at Collier's Weekly.
And they started him at a salary of, what, $12 a week?
$12 a week, which translates to roughly $500 a week in today's currency.
Okay, so not terrible, but not billionaire status yet.
Not yet. Now, Collier's Weekly was a mass-market magazine, but at the time Nast arrived, it was suffering from terrible formatting.
Yeah, tell us about that, because this is where his eye for design really starts.
It featured these dense, intimidating blocks of text. The advertisements were unceremoniously dumped in the back pages like an afterthought, and the readership was completely stagnating.
So it was just ugly and boring.
Basically, yeah. Condé and Robert collaborated to modernize the entire physical product. They hired premium illustrators to break up the text, elevated the caliber of the journalism, and made the really bold decision to raise the newsstand price from 7 cents to 10 cents.
Which seems small, but back then a 3-cent jump is huge. And Condé's primary role was to take this newly polished product and sell it to advertisers.
And he was an absolute savant at it.
Right. By 1900, he had been promoted to the advertising manager for the entire magazine. His compensation just skyrocketed. He was pulling in $40,000 a year, which the historical data notes is the equivalent of about $1.5 million today.
Unbelievable wealth for a young guy.
Totally. He was a millionaire before he even owned his own company.
But while he was amassing this fortune in mass market publishing, his analytical mind started to recognize a glaring inefficiency in the core business model.
Okay, lay it out for us. What was the flaw?
Well, mass market magazines, by definition, target the broadest possible demographic. They want everyone to buy a copy. But Nast looked at the advertising side of the ledger. If a company is selling a high-end Steinway piano or a luxury touring automobile, and they advertise in a magazine with 1 million readers, perhaps only 500 of those readers actually possess the disposable income to purchase the product.
So it's incredibly inefficient.
Extremely. Nast realized that the vast majority of those advertising dollars were entirely wasted on deaf ears.
So he starts envisioning a complete inversion of the publishing model. Instead of targeting everyone, he wanted to target a highly specific, highly affluent niche, what he called a gold-tipped demographic.
The gold-tipped demographic, I love that term.
It's so good. And he actually proved this theory before he bought his first magazine using a side investment he made in something called the Home Pattern Company.
Yes, the dress patterns.
This is so fascinating to me. This is a business that manufactured dressmaking patterns for women. Now, we have to pause here because the innovation he brought to dress patterns completely mirrors how the modern internet works.
It really does. Let me explain how it used to work. The standard practice at the time was super rudimentary. A woman would purchase a standard size 36 pattern.
Okay.
When she got it home, she was entirely responsible for the complex mathematical adjustments required to scale that pattern up or down to fit her specific bodily dimensions.
Which sounds like a nightmare.
It was incredibly tedious and required significant technical skill. Nast identified this as a massive point of friction for the consumer.
So he fixes the friction. He introduces the concept of size grading. He manufactured and printed individually drafted sizes, mathematically scaling the patterns up and down from the standard, so a woman could simply buy her exact size off the rack.
Brilliant.
It really is. Think about how algorithmic personalization works on your smartphone today.
Right.
An algorithm takes a massive, overwhelming ocean of content and mathematically scales it down to fit your exact, personalized dimensions of interest. Nast was executing the early 1900s analog equivalent of an algorithm.
Yeah.
He gave his customers exactly what they needed, tailored to their specific physical dimensions.
And by removing that friction, he generated intense, almost fanatical brand loyalty. He understood that solving a highly specific problem for a highly specific group of people builds unwavering trust.
And in publishing, trust is the ultimate currency.
Exactly. Once he secured that trust, he pivoted to the advertisers. He could guarantee them a highly engaged, loyal audience. The financial results were staggering. Within just 3 years, Nast drove the Home Pattern Company's advertising revenue from a negligible $1,900 a year to $400,000 annually.
Wow. So he proved mathematically that niching down was not just a theoretical concept, it was an incredibly lucrative business strategy.
It was the future.
Yeah. Which brings us to the real genesis of his empire. The Pattern Company proved his thesis, but he knew he needed a cultural vehicle, right? A magazine he could completely control and mold into the ultimate niche product.
So he set his sights on a sleepy little weekly paper in New York called Vogue.
And Vogue has a fascinating origin story that perfectly suited Nast's ambitions. It was founded on December 17, 1892, by a man named Arthur Baldwin Turner.
Turner, right?
Yeah. It cost 10 cents an issue, and its original mission had absolutely nothing to do with global high fashion. Turner's stated goal was simply to document the ceremonial side of life for the New York elite.
The ceremonial side of life.
Such a polite way to say gossip and parties.
Exactly. It was designed to chronicle the habits, the private social gatherings, the debutante balls, and the leisure activities of the upper class. It functioned as a private society diary for the 400.
The 400 being the absolute apex of New York's Gilded Age society, right? As dictated by Caroline Astor.
Correct. It was a newsletter for the 1% of the 1%.
But when Turner died in 1906, the publication was floundering. It had a tiny, stagnant circulation of roughly 14,000 readers, and its advertising revenues were flatlining around $100,000 a year.
It held immense prestige within a tiny circle, but it just wasn't a viable, growing business.
But Nast had been quietly observing the magazine for years. Finally, in 1909, he makes his move and acquires it.
And this is the pivot point in media history. He doesn't just revamp a magazine. He invents an entirely new economic engine. He introduces the class publication.
The class publication. Okay, explain how radical this was.
The radical nature of this concept cannot be overstated. At this moment in history, the undisputed titans of publishing were men like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer.
Giants.
Giants! And their entire philosophy was built on mass circulation. Hearst's yellow journalism was designed to reach the maximum number of eyeballs possible, utilizing sensationalism to drive volume.
Just pumping out as many papers as possible.
Exactly. But Nast looked at Hearst's model and rejected it completely. He decided to prioritize the quality and the inherent wealth of the readership over the sheer volume of the circulation.
Wait, hold on. If you look at this from a basic economic standpoint, it sounds completely counterintuitive. I mean, if you were building a media business in the 1910s, competing with the Hearst Syndicate, how do you make more money by intentionally turning 90% of the population away at the door?
Right, it feels like financial suicide to restrict your own growth.
Exactly.
It does, until you examine the underlying economics of advertising. Nast actually wrote memos instructing his circulation department to actively drop subscriptions in less affluent zip codes.
Drop them. He wanted fewer readers.
He explicitly wrote that the publisher, the editor, and the advertising manager must conspire to gather all their readers from one particular demographic, and he underlined this rigorously to exclude all others.
Wow. Rigorously to exclude all others.
Yes. You have to remember, America, unlike Europe, lacked a hereditary aristocracy. What America was developing was an emerging upper class defined entirely by wealth and conspicuous consumption.
So he was engineering demographic scarcity.
Precisely.
It is the exact same playbook used by modern luxury conglomerates today. Like if Hermes mass-produced the Birkin bag and sold it at every mall in America, it would lose its value overnight.
100%.
They intentionally limit the supply to drive up the desire. Nast did the same thing with information. He built a triad of success. The magazine, the reader, and the advertiser all had to exist in perfect, exclusive alignment.
When a reader picked up Vogue, they recognized immediately that the editorial content, the fashion, the travelogues, the society reports, was tailored exclusively to their high net worth lifestyle.
Right.
Consequently, when an advertiser, whether they were selling Tiffany diamonds, transatlantic luxury cruises, or bespoke automobiles, purchased space in Vogue, they were willing to pay a massive premium.
Because they knew with absolute certainty that 100% of the people viewing their advertisement possessed the capital to actually execute a purchase.
Exactly. Nast was able to drive his ad rates, his CPM, the cost per 1,000 impressions, up to 5 times the rate of his mass market competitors.
That is just brilliant. The ecosystem was flawlessly efficient. The readers enjoyed the advertisements because they functioned as a catalog for their lifestyle, and the advertisers worshiped the readers because they had endlessly deep pockets.
It was a perfect loop.
But Nast was smart enough to know he couldn't curate this world entirely by himself. He recognized his own limitations regarding art and high fashion, so he became a savant at spotting and elevating talent. And he was shockingly progressive for the era in who he empowered.
He was. He entrusted unprecedented executive authority to women and minorities at a time when corporate America was exclusively a white, male enclave.
Tell him about Edna Woolman-Chase.
Oh, her trajectory is amazing. She began her career in the circulation department, performing menial tasks like addressing envelopes. But Nast recognized her editorial instincts and sharp operational mind. By 1914, he elevated her to the position of editor-in-chief of Vogue.
From envelopes to editor-in-chief.
And she held that title for nearly 50 years, becoming the undisputed grand dame of fashion publishing.
And his hiring philosophy extended beyond gender, right? Because in 1920, he hired Jack Dempsey, a black Jewish man, to serve as the sports editor of Vanity Fair. Right. And you really have to contextualize this against the intense systemic racism and anti-Semitism of the 1920s. Nast was planting a flag. He was essentially declaring that his empire operated purely on merit.
If you possessed the most refined eye and the highest level of talent, you had a seat at his executive table, pedigree be damned.
His entire thesis was that true class and elite taste were not strictly genetic. They were acquired through an eye for unparalleled quality. And alongside brilliant editorial minds like Frank Crowninshield at Vanity Fair, Nast's company expanded at a breakneck pace.
He wasn't satisfied with domestic dominance.
No, he launched British Vogue in 1916, navigating the immense complexities of wartime publishing, making Condé Nast the very first company to successfully publish international editions of a magazine.
Which is a huge milestone.
He followed that with French Vogue in 1920. He was meticulously assembling an international cultural hegemony.
So by the mid-1920s, he is just floating above the world. He was generating massive wealth, he was universally respected, and he was pioneering technological advancements. Like in 1924, he introduced the bleed printing process to his magazines.
Oh, the bleed printing.
Yeah, where the ink is pushed right to the physical edge of the page, completely eliminating the white border. It sounds like a minor tweak, but it completely altered how consumers processed physical media.
It really made the images pop.
But, every empire has a vulnerability. Nast's obsession with controlling every aspect of his creation, combined with a blind trust in the financial establishment, led him straight into an economic woodchipper.
Yeah, the turning point really occurs in the late 1920s. Nast decided he needed to own the physical means of production. So he poured millions of dollars into constructing a state-of-the-art printing plant in Greenwich, Connecticut.
He envisioned an industrial utopia.
Literally. The facility featured meticulously landscaped gardens, imported Italian sculptures, and the most advanced printing presses on the planet. But to finance this utopian expansion, he needed capital. Right.
So he turned to his financial advisors at Goldman Sachs, specifically two prominent bankers named Waddell Catchings and Harrison Williams. They aggressively advised him to take Condé Nast publications public.
They pitched him on the massive liquidity of the stock market. And in 1927, they executed the IPO.
And initially, it looked like the smartest decision he ever made.
Oh, totally. The stock debuted at $28.50 a share and rocketed up to $93 a share. Nast was suddenly paper-rich beyond his wildest comprehension.
But the bankers weren't done. Catchings and Williams advised him to take out a massive personal loan, using his newly inflated stock as collateral, to continue funding the Greenwich plant and his own extravagant lifestyle.
But what the bankers deliberately obfuscated from Nast was the macroeconomic reality.
The broader American economy was already flashing severe warning signs of deflation. Housing construction was slowing, property values were dipping, and consumer spending was tightening.
The stock market was an artificially inflated bubble. Exactly, and historical sources strongly indicate that Catchings and Williams were fully aware of the impending correction. They were actively restructuring their own portfolios to weather a crash, yet they left Nast dangerously overleveraged and entirely exposed.
It's just so shady.
They engineered a scenario where, if the market turned, Nast would default on his loans, allowing the banks to seize control of his highly prestigious, cash-generating publishing assets.
And Nast was completely oblivious, largely because he was living inside the fantasy world he had created for his magazines.
Right.
If you want to understand how detached from reality he was, look at his living situation. Right before the crash, he moved into a staggering 30-room duplex penthouse at 1040 Park Avenue.
30 rooms in Manhattan. And the architectural details of that penthouse are vital to understanding his mindset.
Yeah.
He hired Elsie de Wolfe, the pioneer of interior design, to conceptualize it.
We're talking about genuine 18th century Chinese wallpaper, antique parquet floors, imported panel by panel from French chateaus, a custom glass-enclosed solarium on the roof, and a massive ballroom specifically designed to host the cultural elite.
He was hosting legendary Gatsby-level prohibition parties. He was filling actual bathtubs with illegal smuggled champagne and top-shelf whiskey.
Bathtub gin, but make it Vogue.
Exactly. He even bought a sprawling country estate called Sandy Key and dropped $750,000 on renovations solely to have a secondary location for weekend parties.
He didn't just publish the magazines. He genuinely believed he was the main character in them.
But those parties served a distinct corporate function. He utilized those lavish residences as a mise-en-scène. They were theatrical backdrops designed to prove to his advertisers and his high society subjects that Condé Nast was the undisputed epicenter of American glamour.
The decadence was a deliberate marketing strategy.
Yes. The fatal flaw was that he personally financed the illusion with debt guaranteed by an inflated stock price.
Then we hit October 1929, Black Tuesday. The bubble violently bursts. Millions of fortunes are vaporized in a matter of hours. Nast watches his company's stock plummet from $93 a share down to $4.50.
He is instantly ruined.
The margin calls come in, and he finds himself roughly $5 million in debt to the very bankers who structured the loans.
By 1930, the trap sprang shut. The bankers forced their own representative, Sidney Weinberg, onto the Condé Nast board of directors. Nast was being systematically pushed out of his own boardroom.
And the financial collapse triggered a cascade of personal tragedies. The stress began to literally destroy his body.
It was awful.
His marriage to his second wife, Leslie, who was significantly younger, completely disintegrated under the financial strain. He effectively encouraged her to leave him for someone who could actually afford to support her, which she did.
And simultaneously, he is diagnosed with prostate cancer.
Right. And the surgical treatments in the 1930s were brutal and left him dealing with severe, humiliating physical side effects. The compounding stress caused his blood pressure to reach such lethal levels that he had to secretly stash oxygen tanks in his office just to make it through the workday.
The juxtaposition is deeply tragic. The ultimate arbiter of taste, the man whose publications dictated the aesthetic of the elite, was secretly gasping for air behind his desk. His marriage was over, his massive fortune had evaporated, and hostile bankers were dismantling his life's work.
But, his resilience during this period was remarkable. He intuitively understood that the only way to retain leverage was to maintain the illusion of invincibility.
Which is wild.
During the absolute bleakest depths of the Great Depression, when other publishers were cutting every conceivable cost, Nast authorized the transition to full-color photographic covers in 1932. He spent capital. He absolutely did not have to project an image of unshakable stability.
It was the ultimate high-stakes gamble. But the color covers weren't enough to pay off a $5 million debt. He needed a literal miracle to pry the banker's fingers off his company.
And the miracle came in the form of a highly classified rescue operation orchestrated by a British investment banker named Leo Derlanger.
And the connection between Nast and Derlanger sounds like cinematic fiction, but it is entirely true.
Yeah. Tell us how they knew each other.
So years prior, Nast had demonstrated profound kindness to a struggling Vogue model named Edwina Prue. When she was destitute in New York, Nast quietly sent her food baskets and ensured she stayed afloat. Edwina eventually returned to Europe and married Leo Derlanger.
Wow.
Right. So to repay Nast for saving his wife, Derlanger utilized his immense financial network to orchestrate a stealth buyout.
So Derlanger reaches out to Lord Camrose, a phenomenally wealthy British publishing magnate. And they had to execute this entirely in the shadows because if the market, or Nast's fierce rival William Randolph Hearst, caught wind that Condé Nast was vulnerable, Hearst would have swooped in and bought the debt just to crush him.
So they used coded telegrams. Camrose was referred to under the codename Nero or Barrow.
Through these encrypted communications, Camrose structurally maneuvered to quietly purchase Nast's massive debt load and the majority voting shares directly from the hostile bankers.
The brilliance of Camrose's strategy was his recognition that the physical assets, the Greenwich plant, the office furniture, the subscriber lists, were fundamentally worthless without Condé Nast's unique creative vision.
Camrose didn't want to run a New York fashion magazine.
Exactly. So upon acquiring the debt, Camrose allocated a substantial block of shares back to Nast, injected $300,000 of fresh working capital into the business, and legally guaranteed Nast complete, unfettered creative control.
It was a monumental save. The general public, the deeply loyal advertisers, and the vicious competitors never found out. To the outside world, Condé Nast was still the untouchable, independent king of the publishing mountain.
And he maintained that illusion until he suffered a fatal heart attack in 1942. He died leaving a tangled financial web for his heirs, but his cultural legacy, the blueprint of aspirational publishing, was permanently etched into American capitalism.
And that blueprint lay dormant during the austerity of the wartime 1940s and early 50s, but it was waiting to be weaponized.
Nast proved that exclusivity was a highly marketable commodity. The family that eventually purchased his company decades later understood that to dominate the latter half of the 20th century, they had to evolve the model.
They couldn't just sell high-end clothing patterns or society gossip. They had to manufacture and sell the actual myth of untouchable glamour.
Which catapults us to 1959.
The media landscape is shifting again.
S.I. Newhouse Sr., an intensely private mogul who built a spectacularly profitable, quietly expanding empire of unglamorous regional newspapers, decides to purchase Condé Nast for $5 million.
The publishing world was stunned, and there's a famous, probably apocryphal joke about how the deal went down.
Yeah, the lore suggests that his wife, Mitzi Newhouse, casually asked S.I. to pick her up a copy of Vogue while he was out running errands. He returned, having purchased the entire publishing company for her.
While it makes for a charming anecdote about mid-century wealth, Newhouse Sr. was a shark. He saw a distressed, deeply undervalued asset with an unparalleled brand name.
But the true explosion of the company happened under his son.
Yes.
S.I. Newhouse Jr., known universally as Cy, took over as chairman in 1975. Cy Newhouse was a bundle of contradictions. He owned one of the greatest private collections of Rothko paintings in the world, yet he routinely wandered the plush Condé Nast offices wearing a ratty sweatshirt.
But he possessed a granular understanding of the psychological power of the glossy magazine. Under his stewardship, stretching from the 1980s through the early 2000s, Condé Nast entered an era of corporate opulence that makes Condé Nast's 1920s bathtub gin parties look remarkably restrained.
The financial expenditures under Cy Newhouse were not merely lavish. They were strategically, deliberately outrageous. Let's examine the specific mechanics detailed in the Greenbaum text. We are looking at standard employment contracts that included $40,000 annual clothing allowances for senior editors.
And within the building, that figure was considered a modest baseline.
Right. The company maintained a massive fleet of black town cars, engines idling on the Manhattan sidewalks outside their headquarters, retained full-time simply on the off chance an editor needed to travel 8 blocks to a lunch meeting or pick up dry cleaning.
And it wasn't just local transportation. When the Paris fashion collections rolled around, Condé Nast editors weren't flying first class. They were booking out seats on the Concorde,
Shattering the sound barrier while sipping champagne.
because a standard transatlantic flight was considered too pedestrian for the arbiters of style. My absolute favorite anecdote regarding this unrestrained spending involves the legendary photographer Irving Penn.
Oh, the Cartier glasses.
Yes, he was commissioned to shoot a still life involving a broken glass. Condé Nast didn't hand him a prop glass. They financed the purchase of hundreds of exquisitely expensive Cartier crystal glasses, allowing Penn to systematically smash them one by one until he captured the exact, perfect fractal pattern of shattered crystal.
The literary budgets were equally unrestrained. When they launched the business magazine portfolio just before the 2008 crash, they famously paid the author Tom Wolfe a reported $12 a word.
$12 a word.
If you calculate the sheer volume of Wolfe's trademark onomatopoeic prose sentences filled with bam, 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 barama, the company was literally spending thousands of dollars just to print the sound of drum beats.
To an outside corporate consultant, this looks like gross negligence.
Yeah.
But internally, Cy Newhouse operated on a very specific maxim. Waste was an important part of creativity.
Let's actually dig into that concept. The idea that waste is creativity, because on a spreadsheet, it is a catastrophic business plan. But as a marketing strategy in the pre-internet era, it was genius. This era birthed the celebrity editor. We are talking about Anna Wintour at Vogue, Tina Brown, and eventually Graydon Carter at Vanity Fair.
Right. And their job description expanded far beyond selecting typography, reviewing contact sheets, or editing copy. Their mandate was to transform their daily personal lives into a relentless, top-to-bottom marketing campaign for the Condé Nast brand.
They functioned as the original hyper-funded influencers decades before social media platforms existed. The structural logic was that the editor-in-chief had to physically embody the flawless, expensive fantasy the magazine was peddling.
So when a luxury advertiser, say, Prada or Rolex, purchased a spread in Vogue, they weren't merely buying high-gloss ink on heavy stock paper. They were purchasing proximity to Anna Wintour's cultural aura. They were paying a premium for the validation that their product belonged in the impossibly charmed, untouchable world she inhabited.
I look at those editors and I see the exact same mechanics as a modern TikTok or Instagram influencer. The only variable is the scale of the budget.
Today, an influencer negotiates a free weekend at a boutique hotel in exchange for 3 posts. In the 1990s, Condé Nast was quietly underwriting multi-million-dollar personal mortgages for their top editors to ensure they resided in the correct, socially approved zip codes on the Upper East Side.
They were putting minor European aristocrats on retainer as contributing editors simply to secure access to private castles for photo shoots.
They were selling the public a VIP club membership, and the actual physical magazine was just the glossy brochure you got for paying the entry fee. The overwhelming extravagance was the brick and mortar of their authority.
That concept of authority is crucial to understanding their dominance. In the 1980s and 90s, the internet had not yet democratized cultural criticism. The editors at Condé Nast were the absolute gatekeepers of Western culture. They possessed the unilateral power to dictate which independent film was worth seeing, which debut novelist mattered, and which hemline was acceptable.
It was a completely unidirectional flow of information.
And the sheer visible scale of their corporate spending proved to the consumer that their authority was legitimate. If they possessed the capital to shoot a $475,000 fold-out cover, the subliminal message was that their taste was infallible.
But every magic trick relies on a hidden mechanism. The illusion of infinite gushing wealth at Condé Nast was intoxicating to watch, but behind the heavy velvet curtain, the actual ledger was a horror show.
The financial realities were shockingly precarious.
The facade began to crack publicly in 1998. Two journalists, Joseph Nassara and Peter Elkind, published a massive, deeply researched expose in Fortune magazine.
And they managed to penetrate the notoriously secretive financials of the private company.
Yeah, and they revealed that the world's most glamorous, culturally dominant magazine publisher was, mechanically speaking, a terrible business. They reported that Condé Nast ended 1996 generating a meager $55 million in profit on $750 million in total revenue. Right. And when they factored in the massive ongoing financial hemorrhage at the New Yorker, which was technically held in a separate corporate division at the time, the aggregate profit margin for the Newhouse magazine empire hovered at a razor-thin 5%.
How does a company with that level of cultural market share only clear 5%? I mean, if you look across town at Hearst, their eternal, slightly more middle-brow rival, the numbers are mind-boggling.
Hearst's Cosmopolitan magazine, managed by Helen Gurley Brown, generated roughly as much pure profit in 1997 as the entirety of the Condé Nast portfolio combined.
It defies logic that Newhouse allowed the spending to continue. How did the company legally and structurally avoid bankruptcy with those margins?
The survival of the magazines relied entirely on the corporate structure of Advance Publications, the Newhouse family's overarching, privately held parent company. Advance Publications owned an incredibly vast, unglamorous, but highly lucrative network of regional newspapers across the United States. Papers in Cleveland, Portland, New Orleans, alongside massive holdings in cable television infrastructure.
The cash cows.
Exactly. The staggering profits generated by delivering local news and cable wiring in the Midwest were legally and structurally funneled to subsidize the astronomical operating costs of the glossy magazines in New York.
So titles like American Vogue and Vanity Fair were essentially functioning as loss leaders. They were permitted to burn through cash to maintain the cultural prestige and social power of the Newhouse family, fully knowing that the family's newspaper monopoly in Middle America was quietly picking up the tab.
That is precisely the mechanical reality of the operation. The magazines were the glittering hood ornament on a massive, utilitarian corporate vehicle. However, when we discuss this era, we have to address a significant historical blind spot.
Definitely. The narrative of Condé Nast is overwhelmingly dictated by American media reporters like Grinbaum, who focus intensely on the Manhattan-centric drama.
But British journalist Dylan Jones published a sharp critique of this perspective, arguing that focusing solely on New York misses the actual engine of the company during this period.
Dylan Jones basically read the history of the company and said, you missed the actual story.
Right.
He points out that while American editors like Graydon Carter and Anna Wintour were battling for supremacy at Manhattan lunch tables and burning through Advance Publications subsidies to maintain their celebrity status, a much more profitable and creatively radical story was unfolding across the Atlantic.
Jones directs our attention to Condé Nast International, frequently referred to as CNI. This distinct division was led for nearly 3 decades by Jonathan Newhouse, who was C. Newhouse's cousin.
The European perspective, championed by Jones, asserts that CNI was the genuine powerhouse of the publishing universe during the 90s and 2000s. While the U.S. operations were barely breaking even, Jonathan Newhouse was aggressively expanding the brand globally, breaking circulation records, and launching highly profitable editions in emerging luxury markets across Asia and Europe.
And the creative divergence is fascinating. The international editions were often taking massive conceptual risks that the highly commercialized American Vogue simply wouldn't touch.
Right. You look at Vogue Italia during the tenure of the legendary editor Franca Sozzani. She didn't just publish pretty pictures of dresses. She transformed the magazine into a radical laboratory for visual art.
She tackled complex, highly controversial social issues: domestic violence, the BP oil spill, the obsession with plastic surgery, all through provocative cinematic fashion photography.
And later you have British Vogue under Edward Enninful, who completely redefined the aesthetic by championing racial diversity, integrating pop culture, and pushing a much broader, more modern definition of identity.
When analyzing the historical sources, it is important to objectively compare the structural strategies of the two regions. American Vogue was inextricably tied to celebrity culture, massive commercial advertising deals, and preserving a very specific, establishment-oriented fantasy.
It was an incredibly successful commercial formula.
But the international editions, perhaps liberated from the immediate gaze of the New York corporate advertisers, or perhaps responding to a different European cultural sensibility, were empowered to expand the visual vocabulary of fashion. They treated photography as a genuine art form rather than strict commercial product placement.
So you have this fascinating dichotomy. The American flagship is spending nearly $500,000 on a fold-out cover of Hollywood actors to project raw commercial power, while the international decision is quietly generating the real profits and taking the massive artistic leaps.
But regardless of which side of the ocean you were on, the foundational model of the gatekeeper was about to be obliterated.
The structural collapse of the old model was triggered by two massive colliding forces in 2008.
The first was the global macroeconomic financial crisis, which instantly evaporated the massive corporate advertising budgets that Condé Nast relied upon.
And the second, and far more existential threat, was the mass adoption of the smartphone and the concurrent rise of social media. The internet violently democratized the creation and distribution of cultural influence.
The definitive end of the Concord and Caviar era can be pinpointed to the launch and spectacular demise of Portfolio magazine.
We talked about Tom Wolfe's wildly expensive sentence earlier.
Yes, Portfolio was an ambitious business magazine launched by Condé Nast right on the eve of the 2008 crash. It was the ultimate hubristic final act of the new house spending spree. They poured an estimated $100 million to $150 million into the launch.
It was an absolute bacchanalia of spending, and it folded almost immediately as the global economy imploded.
The failure of Portfolio, combined with the recession, forced a brutal, systemic restructuring across the entire Condé Nast portfolio. The era of limitless subsidies from advanced publications was over.
Print editions of historically significant magazines like Teen Vogue, Glamour, and Self were permanently shuttered.
The company initiated painful operational consolidations, pooling their legendary fact-checkers and copy editors into a central shared office, rather than dedicating them to specific magazines. They abandoned highly expensive proprietary publishing software in favor of collaborative, free tools like Google Docs.
The physical real estate footprint shrank dramatically as relentless layoffs transformed from a rare shock into a routine, quarterly reality.
The fundamental problem was that the gatekeepers realized the gates had been torn down. The internet had birthed millions of independent tastemakers. Why would a teenager wait 30 days for a printed issue of Vogue to arrive in the mail to tell them what the trends were, when thousands of fashion bloggers and influencers were uploading their daily outfits and shopping links in real time for free on Instagram?
Condé Nast was forced to pivot from being an untouchable print monarch to fighting a desperate ground war for survival in a fragmented, video-first digital ecosystem.
This brings us to the modern era of the company, guided by current CEO Roger Lynch, who assumed control in 2019.
Lynch's mandate was to completely rebuild the corporate structure. He became the first global CEO, executing the complex task of legally and operationally merging the deeply entrenched U.S. business and Jonathan Newhouse's Condé Nast International into a single, cohesive, global entity.
He introduced the Condé Code, a unified set of corporate values designed to standardize the culture, and he embarked on a relentless strategy to diversify their revenue streams away from print advertising.
Because traditional print advertising, which fueled the private jets and the penthouse mortgages for a century, simply cannot sustain the infrastructure anymore.
The modern playbook is unrecognizable from the Nast or Newhouse eras. They have leaned incredibly heavily into affiliate marketing. The mechanics are simple but lucrative. If you read an article on the Vogue website reviewing the best summer dresses and you click a hyperlink to purchase one, Condé Nast automatically receives a percentage of that transaction.
They have also implemented highly successful digital paywalls, most notably shielding the premium long-form journalism of The New Yorker, proving that a specific segment of the audience will still pay directly for unparalleled editorial quality.
Furthermore, they established Condé Nast Entertainment, known as CNE.
The strategic logic behind CNE was born out of frustration. For decades, Hollywood studios had been optioning phenomenal long-form articles from Condé Nast magazines and adapting them into massive cinematic hits, movies like Brokeback Mountain and Argo.
While Condé Nast received a meager option fee and watched the studios reap hundreds of millions in box office returns.
C&E was built to vertically integrate that intellectual property. They began producing their own film and television adaptations, and crucially, they dominated the digital video space. The 73 Questions series on YouTube is a prime example of transitioning their access to celebrity into highly monetizable global digital entertainment.
But the absolute wildest, most staggering irony of their modern financial survival involves a platform called Reddit.
Oh, this is the best part.
Back in 2006, Advanced Publications, the Newhouse family company, purchased a scruffy, text-heavy, profoundly chaotic message board called Reddit for roughly $10 million.
Culturally, Reddit was the absolute antithesis of the Condé Nast ethos. Reddit has no gatekeepers, it has no elite editors, it is completely user-generated. Anyone with an internet connection can post anything for free. It is the ultimate anti-exclusive, egalitarian platform.
Yet when Reddit executed its initial public offering and went public in 2024, the Newhouse family's retained stake in the platform was valued at an estimated $2.1 billion.
That represents a 210 times return on their initial investment. From a purely economic standpoint, the ultimate egalitarian, uncurated platform is now generating the wealth required to subsidize the ultimate exclusive, highly curated magazine publisher.
It is absolute corporate poetry. And while we are discussing the mechanisms of subsidization, we have to look at how Condé Nast is keeping the lights on through what they call tentpole events. Condé Nast used to sell you a physical printed fantasy. Today, they are selling you a live-streamed reality.
Look at the mechanics of the Met Gala. In 2026, Vogue reported generating 1.696 billion global video views across their platforms during the Met Gala, successfully raising $42 million for the Costume Institute.
The Met Gala is no longer merely a party covered by a magazine. It functions as a standalone, global entertainment monolith that drives massive sponsorship revenue.
They're forced to rely on these events because the digital landscape is shifting under their feet yet again. Search engine traffic, which replaced newsstand circulation as the primary driver of audience, is plummeting.
As artificial intelligence overviews dominating search results, Google traffic to traditional news publishers dropped precipitously between 2023 and 2025.
In response, Condé Nast is adapting its monetization strategy once more. They have begun executing massive multi-year licensing deals with AI developers like OpenAI and Amazon.
They're granting these tech giants access to their meticulously curated 130-year textual and visual archive to train large language models. They're literally licensing the historical genius of their past to generate the capital required to survive the future.
The ultimate signal that the historical era has closed came recently when Anna Wintour announced she was stepping away from the day-to-day, granular editing duties at American Vogue while choosing to retain her overarching global titles as Chief Content Officer.
That transition signifies a monumental structural shift. It confirms that Condé Nast has definitively entered a post-print reality. The overarching brand, the intellectual property of Vogue World, the e-commerce engine of Vogue Shopping, the global licensing deals, is now infinitely more valuable than the physical paper it was originally printed on.
The physical magazine has been demoted. It is no longer the core revenue-generating product. It functions more as the prestigious crest sewn onto the blazer of a highly diversified, multi-platform media corporation.
And it's vital to note that despite these immense structural upheavals, the publications have consistently maintained their role in documenting the macro-cultural shifts of our era.
Whether that involves featuring prominent political figures like Kamala Harris on the cover, or publishing rigorous historical retrospectives on controversies like Coco Chanel's wartime alignments, the sources show that the magazines continue to impartially record the cultural narrative, proving how deeply entwined the brand remains with the broader historical record.
It is a phenomenal, century-spanning story of adaptation. We have traced it from Condé Nast's initial mathematical genius with dress patterns, through the Newhouse family's extravagant Concord-fueled myth-making, all the way to Roger Lynch's ruthless digital diversification.
It really is an incredible journey.
As we wrap up this analysis, we want to leave you with a couple of specific recommendations. Things you can explore on your own to visually understand the concepts we've discussed today. I highly recommend taking a moment to visually witness the exact technological pivot Condé Nast made during the Great Depression. Go online and search for the Vogue covers from the early 1930s.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Specifically, pull up the issues transitioning from 1931 to 1932. You will see these gorgeous, highly stylized, hand-drawn Art Deco illustrations suddenly, jarringly give way to the very first full-color photographic images. It is a visual shock to the system, and it perfectly encapsulates how Nast deployed cutting-edge technology to project modern power when his financial world was crumbling.
Building on that visual history, I suggest exploring the Vogue archive online, which is a phenomenal monetized digital resource Condé Nast has built. Filter your search to the magazines published from 1924 onwards, and pay specific attention to the physical edges of the pages.
The bleed printing.
This is where Nast pioneered the bleed printing process we discussed. You can see the exact moment where the ink was finally allowed to run completely off the edge of the paper stock, permanently removing the traditional framing white border.
It sounds like an incredibly minor, arcane technical detail, but it profoundly altered the visual psychology of the reader. It made the images feel boundless, immersive, and endless. It was a subtle yet massive revolution in how humanized process printed media.
We've traveled from a 10-cent society diary tracking the Astor family in the 1890s to billion-dollar AI licensing deals negotiating with algorithms today.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought for you to mull over. We currently operate in a digital landscape where every single person holding a smartphone possesses the technological capability to be their own editor-in-chief, their own broadcaster, and their own tastemaker.
The internet aggressively tore down the velvet ropes and the exclusive barriers that Condé Montrose Nast spent his entire life building.
Yet, look at the enduring, almost fanatical cultural obsession with the Met Gala red carpet, or the absolute frenzy that still erupts over a highly guarded Vogue cover reveal. In an era of total, unfiltered digital democracy, do we secretly still crave the snobbery, the gatekeeping, and the beautifully curated illusion of exclusivity that Condé Nast invented?
Do we intrinsically still desire a higher authority to filter the noise and dictate what is truly undeniably glamorous?
It's a fascinating question to consider the next time you are scrolling through the endless, uncurated noise of your social feed. Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Deep Dive, exploring the complex history of more taste than money. As always, stay curious.